The courtroom was silent, not the kind of silence born from peace, but the heavy, suffocating hush that wraps itself around fear and truth. The walls were beige, clinical, stripped of emotion. Cameras had been banned. No flashes, no microphones, only the measured tick of a government-issued clock above the judge's bench. It was the kind of room where lives changed with words. And Beyoncé was about to speak. She sat upright, spine stiff, dressed in muted black. Not glamorous, not Queen Bey, just a woman, one who had carried something unspeakable for far too long. Her eyes didn't scan the room. She didn't look for sympathy. She looked inward, as if pulling strength from the years she'd spent surviving. A bailiff stepped forward. His voice was neutral, professional, but the weight of what he said hung like lead. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" Beyoncé nodded. One slow, deliberate movement. The kind of nod that says, "I've waited years for this moment." And then, the door to the past cracked open. Suddenly we hear it. The blurred edges of a grainy audio file, stitched together from memory and surveillance. The sound of chaos, a woman's scream, the violent slam of a door, muffled footsteps. Then, a voice, unmistakable, cold, and raw with power. "You don't walk out on me." The room doesn't move. No one breathes. This documentary contains descriptions of abuse, coercion, and emotional trauma. The stories within are disturbing, because they are real. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. The gavel cracks. To the world, she was untouchable. A vision carved from gold, polished under stage lights and immortalized in every headline that dared to speak her name. Beyoncé Knowles Carter, Queen Bey, was not just a performer. She was a phenomenon, a woman who carried the weight of excellence and the expectation of perfection like a crown she was born to wear. The public didn't just love her, they revered her. She had long since transcended the word celebrity. This was a woman who sold out stadiums on 3 continents, stood beside presidents, and moved culture with the flick of a wrist or the release of a surprise album. Her image was airtight, flawlessly curated, obsessively controlled, and yet deeply resonant. She was power and poise, grace and grit, all in one. "She's more than a performer. She's a movement," Rolling Stone once declared. "A voice for Black women everywhere," wrote Essence magazine, capturing what millions already felt. There were the accolades, over 30 Grammy Awards, a historic Coachella performance that transformed a music festival into a cultural moment, the Time magazine cover that called her the world's most influential woman, and the success of Ivy Park, a brand that blended fashion with empowerment. When Renaissance dropped in 2022, critics and fans alike praised her for once again rewriting the rules, sonically, visually, and spiritually. Every frame of Beyoncé's career seemed dipped in destiny. And yet, shadows were forming just outside the light. Because while the world was dancing, praising, idolizing, something was shifting behind the curtain. It began subtly. In 2023, paparazzi at LAX began shouting questions that didn't quite make sense. Strange phrasing, odd insinuations. "Did you ever work with Diddy privately?" "Do you have any comment on what happened in 2006? "She didn't stop walking." Then came the headlines. TMZ. Diddy's name linked to multiple lawsuits. The cut. Inside the culture of silence in hip-hop's elite circles. Names were starting to surface. Whispered timelines didn't quite align. And for the first time in years, Beyoncé's team issued a response that wasn't powerful. It was silent. No comment. And for an artist whose silence had always been seen as strategy this time, it felt different. Ominous. Like silence, not for control, but for survival. Before she became a monolith, before the world bowed to her presence, Beyoncé was just a girl from Houston with a voice that could shake rafters, and a father with a plan. Destiny's Child was the vessel, and Matthew Knowles was the captain. From the very beginning, Beyoncé's life was molded not around adolescence, but around ambition. While other girls were navigating prom and puberty, she was learning lighting cues, vocal stacking, and how to survive in rooms full of men who saw young talent not as daughters, but as currency. Under her father's management, Destiny's Child was a well-oiled machine. But the Polish had a price. Every movement was choreographed. Every word, rehearsed. Every slip, punished. There was no room for error, no space for rest. Perfectionism wasn't just encouraged, it was required. And Beyoncé absorbed it like oxygen. Quiet, obedient, driven beyond belief, she learned early how to smile through exhaustion and how to shrink her discomfort behind studio glass. That's when he entered the frame. Sean Diddy Combs was already a legend in the making, the architect of Bad Boy Records, a kingmaker with a Midas touch and a Rolodex that stretched through every corner of the industry. He was everywhere: award shows, after parties, executive meetings. To a young Beyoncé, he was just another power figure, but to those watching closely, the way he watched her was different. Industry events brought them into proximity, quick conversations at Clive Davis parties, a nod backstage at the BET Awards. Then the invites started. You should stop by the studio tonight. Let's get dinner. Talk about music. You've got something special. Let me help you shape it. Late-night mentorship was the code, and in the music industry, it often meant something else entirely. People noticed, but no one intervened. A former backup singer who asked to remain anonymous remembered an after-party at a Manhattan loft in 2001. He didn't look at her like a mentor. He looked at her like a predator sizing up a prize. She was maybe 19. Maybe. I remember thinking, she shouldn't be here. She was warned. Quietly. Cautiously. Other women who had passed through the same channels offered veiled warnings. Be careful. He's powerful. If he puts you on his radar, you either become his ally or his casualty. The pressure escalated. Invitations began to feel more like summons. There were murmurs of exclusivity, requests for her to perform at private events, studio sessions with no other producers present, one-on-one meetings that stretched into the early morning, stories that drifted through green rooms like smoke. Beyoncé showed up and left 5 minutes later looking pale. She canceled a session last minute, said she was sick, but never explained. Years later, a veteran producer who worked briefly with both of them recalled, there was a session he brought her in for. She was so quiet, not her usual self. She kept checking the clock. At one point, I caught her eyes, and I swear to God, she looked scared. Like she didn't want to be there, but couldn't leave. These moments, individually, meant nothing to the machine, just fragments of gossip, shrugged off as rumors. She was young. She was ambitious. She was protected by her father. Who would dare? But the red flags weren't just there. They were waving, furiously, painfully, while everyone turned their heads. Because back then, she wasn't Beyoncé, the force of nature. She was just a girl in a world built to consume her. And the man who would later sit across from her in a courtroom, he didn't just notice her rise, he wanted to own it. Between 2003 and 2006, Beyoncé's star was blazing. She had just released Dangerously in Love, breaking free from Destiny's Child to cement herself as a solo powerhouse. Her voice, her poise, her vision, they were no longer part of a group identity. She was now Beyoncé, full stop. But even meteors pass through darkness. And behind the glamour of her rise, something deeply unsettling was beginning to unravel. There were rumors, quiet ones, coded in industry language. Whispers of a shelved collaboration with Sean Combs, known then as the ever-present, all-powerful Diddy. It had been announced informally. A cross-branding venture, some whispered studio magic, a potential remix of a track that never saw the light of day. But just as quickly as it emerged, it vanished. Those close to the project claimed Beyoncé was abruptly pulled. No statement, no press release, just silence. Years later, when confidential documents from an anonymous leak began to surface in the shadows of a growing legal storm around Diddy, one line stood out like a bloodstain. Subject agrees not to disclose terms of meeting dated July 9, 2004. Violations subject to damages no less than $10 million. It was an NDA, allegedly signed under pressure. The language was aggressive, legally airtight. The date matched with a time Beyoncé had suddenly canceled a high-profile appearance and gone dark for nearly 2 weeks. Then there was the session. Some in her team still call it the lost track. An unreleased collaboration reportedly recorded at Diddy's personal studio in Miami, a track that no one has ever heard. The files were never sent to her team. When her label asked for access, they were stonewalled. Beyoncé never spoke of it, not publicly, not even privately, according to her inner circle. But something changed after that. A former assistant who was present the night she returned from that trip described a moment frozen in her memory. She walked in, no makeup, didn't say a word, went straight to her room. I remember hearing her shower for like an hour, then just silence. It was like the light had been dimmed. She wasn't the same for days. You could feel it. Around this time, reports began to emerge, never confirmed, always denied, about Diddy's behavior behind closed doors. Control, gaslighting, emotional manipulation. He would charm, then demand. Lure, then isolate. Women who had once worked with him stopped answering calls. Producers began requiring contracts with behavioral clauses when his name was attached. But no one, not publicly, said a word. Beyoncé began to distance herself, subtly, surgically. Invitations declined, studio offers ignored, public appearances carefully choreographed to avoid crossing paths. But in the tight circles of hip-hop's elite, silence is noticed and punished. Suddenly, she began disappearing from certain events. Industry insiders said she had scheduling conflicts, but those close to her saw the pattern. Panels where her name had been floated, then dropped. Fashion events with mutual friends that suddenly didn't include her. One marketing executive claimed a brand campaign she was shortlisted for mysteriously shifted to another bad boy-affiliated artist. Jay-Z's role in all of this was complicated. At the time, he and Beyoncé were still building their empire, publicly in love, musically aligned, and privately navigating a minefield of egos and alliances. Jay and Diddy weren't just friends. They were business partners in ventures that stretched across music, fashion, and alcohol. K-Rock and Rock Nation were born in the same boardrooms. Their relationship was financial, fraternal, and fragile. Sources say Jay-Z was protective, yes, but also pragmatic. There were moments, said one longtime Rock Nation staffer, where it felt like he was walking a tightrope. On one side, the woman he loved. On the other, a partner who could burn millions in deals if crossed. I don't think he silenced her, but I don't think he pushed for her voice either. And in this industry, that's a choice. The betrayal wasn't loud. It didn't come in the form of a scandalous headline or a leaked photo. It came in absence, in her name, missing from lineups where she belonged, in phone calls that stopped, in smiles that felt strained, in the moments where she wasn't invited and no one asked why. No one said Diddy's name, not out loud. Not yet. But the silence around her was starting to echo, and somewhere beneath that silence, a reckoning was beginning to breathe. In the aftermath of her quiet severing from Diddy's orbit, Beyoncé didn't fall. She fortified. Her response wasn't to retreat, but to double down on precision, to tighten every thread of her public persona until it became armor. She went into what those closest to her now call hyper-control mode. Every word, every movement, every visual became curated not just for the sake of artistry, but for protection. Silence, for her, became more than a strategy. It became survival. She stopped doing interviews. Entire press runs for albums passed without a single sit-down. Even Oprah, whom she once called a guiding light, was declined. When she did speak, it was through lyrics, through symbolism, through visuals that offered layers but rarely answers. Her performances became sermons, her music videos, puzzles. Behind every veil of glamour was a woman gripping the reins so tightly it left marks. The trauma didn't disappear, it just dressed itself in sequins. Behind closed doors, the cost was clear. Private sources close to her team recall years where therapy became a regular part of her routine. There were signs of PTSD, one former confidant disclosed, avoidance of certain names, recurring nightmares, hypervigilance around male executives. Even her security team expanded, not just in size, but in training. Every hotel room checked, every schedule run through multiple clearances. She no longer walked into a room unprepared, because once she had, and it had changed everything. And then there was the music. In Lemonade, the world heard the thunder in her voice, the quake beneath her rage. Much of it was interpreted through the lens of marital infidelity, but for those paying closer attention, certain lines seemed to hint at something deeper, something unspoken. You know I give you life. If you try this again, gon' lose your wife. Don't hurt yourself. I ain't thinking about you. Middle fingers up. Put 'em hands high. Sorry. These weren't just declarations of romantic betrayal. They were war cries. The voice of a woman who had been cornered, silenced, and made to question her power, only to rise with more. But even in triumph, something lingered. When Ivy Park launched, insiders described the moment not just as a brand debut, but as a reclamation. The campaign was fierce, diverse, unapologetic, body positive, drenched in control and command. Yet behind the camera, she was distant, observant. She ran the set like a fortress. She wasn't mean, a photographer recalls, but she wasn't present either. It was like she was scanning for something, even while smiling, like her guard never came down. And it never really did. Beyoncé began to build empires, not just in music, but in fashion, film, streaming, philanthropy. Each project was another layer of insulation, another citadel around her core. And while the public called it genius, and it was, some part of it was also survival instinct. Because for all the awards and accolades, for all the praise and power, she knew something the world didn't. He was still out there, still rich, still connected, still feared. She wasn't just protecting herself from headlines or haters or press, she was building walls to protect herself from him. It was the spark no one expected, and yet, in retrospect, everything had been leading to it. In late 2023, the industry's carefully maintained silence began to crack. Cassie Ventura, once the muse of Diddy's empire, filed a lawsuit that detonated like a grenade in the heart of hip-hop's elite. The charges were staggering: grooming, emotional manipulation, trafficking, coercion, assault. But it wasn't just the content of her allegations that shook the world, it was the courage behind them. For years, she had been a whisper, a shadow at events, her story speculated on but never told. Now, she was naming names, and the biggest name was Diddy's. The suit was graphic, disturbing, detailed, and it opened a floodgate. Other lawsuits began to surface, some new, some long buried. Patterns emerged, timelines overlapped, and in the margins of one sealed document, later cited in a leaked court summary, was a name that changed the conversation entirely: Beyoncé Knowles Carter. At first, the mention was hushed, a single line in a footnote, referenced only by initials. But journalists dug deeper, and a whistleblower, once a paralegal for a firm involved in the discovery process, released a redacted excerpt of an old deposition from a 2006 case that had been sealed before reaching trial. The witness, BK, was present at a recording session at Redacted Studio, during which Mr. Combs was alleged to have engaged in inappropriate conduct. This witness was advised not to speak further on the matter, per terms agreed to by management representatives. The world paused. Speculation erupted like wildfire. Was BK really Beyoncé? If so, why hadn't she come forward? Who had silenced her, and why? Social media imploded. Hashtags trended for days. Let Beyoncé speak, dismantle the machine. Silenced by power. Think pieces poured in from every outlet. Feminist scholars, abuse survivors, and entertainment analysts all asked the same chilling question. If even Beyoncé stayed silent, what does that say about what women face in this industry? For decades, she had been a symbol of power, the woman who couldn't be touched. But now, people began to see her in a new, more human light. A woman who, despite her fame and fortune, had perhaps once been cornered by the same monster others now accused. The pressure was mounting, not on Beyoncé to speak, but on the systems that kept her silent. Activist groups demanded transparency. Legal analysts questioned how many times her name had been omitted from public court records due to NDAs and settlements. Online sleuths mapped timelines, uncovering instances where her sudden public absences aligned with Diddy's presence. And then, in January 2024, her team released a statement. It was brief, but it sent shockwaves. Mrs. Knowles Carter has agreed to cooperate fully with the federal investigation concerning Mr. Combs. She has submitted testimony in a sealed evidentiary hearing and requests privacy as this legal process unfolds. The silence was finally broken. It wasn't a song. It wasn't a visual album or a lyric laced with double meaning. It was a fact. Cold, legal, undeniable. She was testifying. For some, the moment was met with disbelief. For others, relief. But for everyone who had followed her career, who had idolized her resilience, it marked a turning point not just for her, but for an entire generation of women who had learned to smile through powerlessness. Beyoncé, the untouchable, the unbreakable, the mythic, was now a witness. And the world held its breath, waiting to hear what she had kept buried for 20 years. The air in the federal courtroom was thick, not just with tension, but with the weight of history. It was 2025, but what was about to unfold had been 2 decades in the making. The room was sealed tight, cameras banned, cell phones confiscated. Outside, protesters shouted and news vans hummed like insects circling fresh blood. Inside, a hush settled as Beyoncé Giselle Knowles-Carter, the most famous woman in the world, took the stand. She wore all black, not glamorous, not performative, monastic almost. Her hair pulled back, face bare, hands clasped in her lap, as though preparing for a funeral or an exorcism. The courtroom artist, tucked in a corner, sketched only the outlines. But the sketch could never capture the true image, the slight tremble in her fingers, the quiet storm in her eyes. The prosecutor approached gently, as if they knew the power of what was about to be said. "Mrs. Knowles-Carter, can you tell us about the night in question?" She nodded. Then, silence. Not the silence of nerves, the silence of choosing which memory to unleash first. "It was late. I was invited to a private after-party following a recording session. I was told it was just a few people, industry folks, safe." She paused. "When I arrived, the lights were low. The doors were locked behind me. He was there. So were 2 of his assistants, and others. I didn't know them." Her voice didn't crack, but her hands betrayed her. "I was offered something to drink. I said no. I was told that wasn't really an option." She described the music being turned up, the laughter, the sudden isolation, how she was steered into a side room to talk, how the energy shifted from charming to coercive, the way Diddy loomed in the doorway when she tried to leave, the things he said to her, veiled threats disguised as advice. He told me, if I ever spoke about what happened, I'd regret it, that no one would believe me, that I'd be blacklisted, humiliated, ruined. A quiet gasp echoed through the gallery. Even the judge's pen stilled. Diddy, seated across the room with his legal team, stared at the table. He did not, could not, meet her eyes. The prosecutor asked, "Why didn't you say something back then?" Beyoncé answered not just for herself, but for countless women before her. "There's a difference between fear and silence," she said, voice steady. "I was afraid then. I'm not now." The words dropped like thunder in the room. Not loud, but seismic, echoing across years of whispered rumors, NDA-covered wounds, and long nights where she sang through pain the world never saw. She continued, recounting the pressure to sign a non-disclosure agreement days later, how her team was threatened, how she was warned that speaking out would risk not just her career, but her family's safety. "I wasn't Beyoncé yet," she admitted, "not the woman you all know. I was still someone's daughter, someone's product. I didn't own my voice. Not then." The final question came from the bench itself. The judge asked simply, "Why testify now?" Her answer was quiet, but firm. "Because silence didn't protect me. It protected him. And I'm done with that." That was the moment it became more than a case. It became a reckoning. She stepped down from the stand not as an icon, but as a woman who had reclaimed her story. And though the court transcript would be sealed, though the media would only hear fragments, one truth became inescapable. Beyoncé had finally said his name. And now the world had to listen. The world didn't pause. It detonated. Within hours of leaked court transcripts confirming Beyoncé's testimony, the internet caught fire. Not with scandal, not with salacious curiosity, but with something deeper, something angrier, something long overdue. Beyoncé Testifies surged to the top of global trending charts. It was joined by Survivor Voices and Mute Diddy, hashtags that didn't just mark a moment, they marked a movement. Across social media, timelines turned into digital war zones. Survivors came forward with their own stories. Women and men in the industry began posting cryptic confessions, side-eyes at the parties, warnings they once received. It wasn't just Beyoncé's truth that was echoing now. It was the collective memory of everyone who'd once swallowed fear in the name of fame. The backlash was swift and total. Within 24 hours, K-Rock announced it was ending all affiliations with Diddy. A press release from Revolt TV said he would take a permanent leave of absence. Brands fell like dominoes. fashion lines, endorsements, even his long-standing collaborations with alcohol distributors and tech ventures. There was no PR campaign big enough to outshine a woman like Beyoncé saying, "He threatened me." The silence of others became deafening. Notably, Jay-Z, her husband, longtime partner, and Diddy's former collaborator, said nothing. No tweet, no post, no comment. It sent the internet spiraling into speculation. Was he complicit? Protective? Torn? The silence cracked the image of the power couple, if only briefly, and reminded the world how tangled loyalty becomes when fame, friendship, and fear intersect. In contrast, a quiet chorus of support began to emerge. Rihanna posted a black square with one word: believe. Billie Eilish shared lyrics from Beyoncé's I Was Here. Pharrell, once a Diddy collaborator, posted a story that read, "Truth is undefeated. Love to all survivors." Think pieces flooded every major publication. Variety called it the moment the industry's silence turned to ash. Essence hailed Beyoncé's testimony as a seismic shift in survivor culture. Rolling Stone featured a full-cover photo of her walking into the courthouse, shadowed and determined, with the headline, "The Day the Game Changed." But the most haunting response came not from a headline or a post, but from Beyoncé herself, in art, where she speaks loudest. Months later, when the Renaissance Tour film premiered, it carried a new dedication. It wasn't announced. It wasn't teased. It came quietly, like the end of a prayer. For those who spoke when silence was survival. White text on black screen. No music, no visuals. Just a breath, a reckoning, a memorial. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everyone who had been told to stay quiet. Everyone who had watched powerful men bury truth beneath NDAs, hush money, and golden boy mythologies. Beyoncé didn't just testify against Diddy. She testified for a generation that had been told their pain wasn't profitable. And in doing so, she didn't lose her crown. She reforged it, in fire. The storm passed, but its thunder kept echoing. Diddy, once untouchable, now stood at the center of a federal investigation expanding by the week. His empire, once sprawling and defiant, began to rot from within. More women came forward. Their stories, though unique, carried hauntingly similar notes: control, coercion, silence bought and enforced. One by one, the walls he built began to collapse. Not with explosions, but with the quiet relentlessness of truth finally given air. And while the headlines screamed his name in downfall, Beyoncé chose stillness. She did not tour. She did not post. She did not speak. Not out of fear this time, but out of choice. She returned to something simpler. Real. A life beyond stage lights and courtroom whispers. A few months later, a rare image surfaced. Beyoncé in a sunlit garden. Hair unstyled, wearing a linen dress, hands buried in the soil. Not curated, not capitalized. Just human. That fall, a limited vinyl poetry album was quietly released. No fanfare, no press. Just her voice, low and deliberate, layered over soft instrumentals. It was called Ashes and Honey. In one piece, she recites, "They tried to name me broken. I named myself reborn. Not spotless, not whole, but mine." It wasn't triumphal. It was tender. Real healing rarely roars. It hums. It lingers, and it rebuilds in silence. Meanwhile, the courtroom door that once opened to history closed behind her. The world outside had changed, irrevocably. The girl who once walked into a studio at 17, trusting too much, was gone. In her place stood a woman who had lived, lost, and testified, not just against a man, but against an entire culture of suppression. Beyoncé didn't set out to become the voice of a movement. She simply told the truth. And in doing so, she cracked the mask of an industry that had devoured its daughters for decades. She didn't just testify against him, she testified for every woman who was told to smile and stay silent.